Today, hundreds of migrants showed up at City Hall demanding better treatment. They say they just want a job and basic shelter.
And Chopper 2 was overhead this afternoon, showing the large group outside City Hall just how many people this issue is impacting. The steps of City Hall.
So asylum seekers are figuring out that the country's largest sanctuary city may not actually care if they achieve the American dream, and they're not happy about it.
Now, this group started to form about 9:30 this morning. All of them out here protesting the city and how they say it's handling migrants.
They are young guys. Look at them. They are 19 years, 20 years. They are ready to war.
I'm very upset about it because I was not thinking it would be like this because of lack of shelter, lack of job.
We have been clear since day one that the right to shelter was never intended to apply to large-scale migrant populations arriving without housing or legal work status.
They say, I'm able-bodied, I don't want to stay in these shelters, I want to be able to take care of myself.
Federal immigration laws are either slowing down the process or, depending on what country they come from, it makes them ineligible.
The White House has repeatedly said that the solution to this crisis lies with Congress, but it's unlikely that Democrats and Republicans would be able to come together on a bipartisan agreement to make real policy changes.
Migrants from countries including Senegal, Mauritania, and Haiti speak French or their native language, and that makes everything more difficult.
So due to recent backlash, the city might roll back its controversial shelter eviction policies. But what nobody's talking about is that New York's Asylum industrial complex was never set up to benefit the very people it's promised to take care of. Critics say it's been setting people up to fail since the moment they arrive, with poor quality food and promises of a brighter future that's never going to materialize. And now people are upset, as they should be. But everything they're upset about is the fault of a city which is so poorly run, it's been failing its own residents for years, with an irreversible housing crisis, giving us some of the highest rents in the country, a grocery affordability crisis, and an employment crisis with many workers struggling to make ends meet as part of the gig economy. But the real reason New York's asylum seekers should be upset is because although the city did an amazing job helping them get here and move into a shelter, that's the last thing they did for these guys. And now you've got thousands of people unable to work who will soon be evicted from city shelters, homeless unless they find jobs that help them pay New York City rent. But the problem is those folks can't work, which has many people very confused, asking what's the purpose of a system that invites people here, houses them, and then evicts them, threatening them with homelessness. What's the point of that? Who benefits from that? On top of that, this crisis has been going on for over a year, and now it's come out that it may have been set up to unfairly benefit some asylum seekers at the expense of others. So here we are underneath the scaffolding at the base of one of New York City's nicest shelters, the Row Hotel, a former luxury hotel right here in Midtown Manhattan. But that two-tier asylum process that may exist, well, shelters like this and the Roosevelt Hotel, its sister shelter, these are reserved only for families. And a lot of the single men who can't get jobs right now don't have a family. But these shelters have been run this way since the very beginning of this crisis over a year ago. And although the city's tried to do its best for everybody in its care, because the accommodations are so much better for families that have children, it almost looks like the city is trying to disincentivize single folks from coming here while still inviting them to come here.
Every migrant we spoke with has something in common. They want to work. Right now, they're trying to cut through all the red tape that's stopping them, asking local leaders to put pressure on Washington, D.C. to make a change.
Now, most people know that the entire asylum situation here is a complete mess. Now, at first, it sounds like a great system. People from all over the world can come here and get a place to stay while they get back on their feet, while building new lives for themselves here in America. And regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with how New York City's handling this, if you were living in a country like Venezuela and you wanted to flee extreme poverty, that would sound like a pretty good deal. But the truth is, it's anything but. And that's what people are starting to figure out. Because even though the city's providing the folks in its care with everything they need, food, clothing, medical treatment, a place to stay, the setup here here is that people living in hotels like this, even the nice ones, have been led to believe that employment opportunities were on the horizon and that people here would be able to start working. But no, that hasn't been the case, and people came here, moved into shelters based on that belief, and now they're being told they have to leave. And that's a problem because the shelter population right now is around 70,000 people, all of whom are totally reliant upon the city for everything because they can't do the one thing everybody came here to do, which is to work and build a better life for themselves. And the ridiculous thing about this is that the rules stopping people from working have existed for decades, and everybody running the shelters knew it. And they didn't dissuade people from believing that they would get jobs while they moved them in.
Federal immigration laws are either slowing down the process for these migrants to get working permits, or depending on what country they come from, it makes them ineligible.
So many of the people that were at this rally, they spent months coming here, thousands of dollars, and they left a lot behind that they may never be able to go back to, only to find out that it was all for nothing. This is not an endorsement or condemnation of how this is being handled, but it does help explain why people are upset. They were moved into these shelters thinking something would happen, and no one talked them out of it. Plus, at many of the city's shelters, they've got caseworkers waiting, especially at the Roosevelt Hotel Welcome Center, that help people fill out their asylum application, get their shelter placement, get their prepaid debit card. All that stuff happens very quickly, but there's one thing that takes forever, and that is the process for getting work authorization. Again, it's not something that the city controls. It can take 6 months to a year, but it doesn't for everybody, and this is where the two-tier system comes back into play. Because some of the folks living in the shelters qualify for something called temporary protected status, which is a humanitarian designation from the U.S. government that greatly speeds up applications for work authorization. Temporary protected status actually applies to everyone seeking asylum who's from Venezuela because of the extreme poverty and conditions in that particular country, and although to some people that sounds like the compassionate thing to do, others see it as unfairness. But what nobody's talking about is that the city's leaders have known the entire time who had TPS, who didn't, and for some reason people now living in shelters believe that they should be working sooner than was ever possible. How come nobody explained that to people? Why did they let people move in thinking one thing which was never going to be true?
Governor Kathy Hochul has tried to speed along the process. These migrants are also up in arms over language access barriers and temporary shelters, saying 30 days isn't long enough.
This is the point in the story where things take a turn for the worst. Because although the asylum complex provides people with everything they need when the crisis first began, there was no limit to how long people could stay in one of the city's shelters. And what that means is that even if work authorization was going to take longer than 30 days, it wasn't a problem because people weren't being evicted after 30 days. But now they are, after they've left everything to move in. What a scam. And now, once people get evicted, they cannot reapply for shelter. They are effectively homeless, and they effectively can't support themselves. Immigration critics would place the blame for this entirely upon the people with whom it affects. And look, everybody knows the city cannot house an unlimited number of people for an unlimited number of time, but how do you invite people into a homeless shelter that is supposed to rehabilitate people and get them back on their feet, and then kick them out before any of that ever happens when they're not suited for providing for themselves in this expensive city? Many people would say that the city does in fact bear some responsibility for the plight of people it promised to care for and now has changed how they're going to do it. On top of that, the city's rapid rollout and provision of other services like asylum applications, that might be part of the problem, because after you file an asylum claim, you can't just roam the country. All of your correspondence goes to the address where you submitted that claim, which is likely your shelter, which even families are now evicted from after 60 days. And with all of these facts, it's hard to understand how this system is helping anybody who's part of it. Yes, it's very generous, it's very expensive, it provides everything for people, but it's failing in its mission of helping them get out of it, right? Once they're in, they're stuck there. Let's say you moved into a little hotel room like this. Caseworkers got you all excited that your life was about to be great. Then 30 days later, you got no job and you're out on the street. But when you look at how ridiculous this entire operation is and how it doesn't help the people that are in it, a clear beneficiary does emerge. But the people benefiting from this are already rich. Building right here is the Candler Building. It's an 800-bed single men's shelter in Midtown down the street from the Row Hotel. And even though the people living inside the building aren't getting much out of it, the owners of the building, they're doing pretty well. And believe it or not, the city is spending around $400 a night caring for every single person who lives inside. Plus, they pay millions of dollars to rent this building and use it as a shelter.
The city is states, legal aid, and Coalition for the Homeless all reached an agreement that will limit how many newly arriving single adult migrants can reapply for a shelter bed after their 30-day shelter limit is up.
So when the single adult evictions first started happening, at places like this, there were people who'd been living here for over a year and had to go. Just go. Leave, go, we don't care where. Now, predictably, the city's offer of right to shelter is why facilities like this filled up pretty much immediately. And once the shelters were full, we came to a point where the city's laws prevented it from making a decision. For example, when a hotel fills up, the hotel stops taking new reservations until the current guests have completed their time staying there. But since the city's right to shelter applies to everybody, the city had no choice but to turn its shelters into revolving door operations where people would leave so new people could show up and then those people would leave. Just a big cycle. A cycle that generates money for the owners of the shelter and doesn't really help the people who revolve through it. Now, at first, the policy of evicting folks from shelters wasn't protested because people could reapply. And although getting evicted meant you had to pack your bags and leave, you would always get replaced in another facility somewhere. And while the city was doing things that way, they claimed that 50% of the people who were evicted from shelters did not come back to reapply for a subsequent placement. They claimed that that was a successful policy. But in spite of how successful the city claims that policy was, they've now taken the extra step to block all reapplications, which is why people now feel like the system has tricked them and duped them. And here's where the two-tier system comes back into play. Families get evicted after 60 days, but they can still reapply. The banned reapplications only apply to single adults, meaning it looks like it's arbitrarily tougher for them.
We have been clear since day one that the right to shelter was never intended to apply to large-scale migrant populations arriving without housing or legal work.
So it's important to understand that these protests are happening now, that all of the people there have nowhere else to go. They can't go back to a place like the Candler Building. And in their defense, they had no indication that the city's policies would suddenly change. Many of these folks may have even known how long the asylum process was likely to take and how they couldn't have started working right away. But if you're aware that work permission takes 6-7 months, and that's what you're told when you move into a shelter, and then the rules suddenly change, you'd be pretty upset too. But even if the folks inside the shelter are all given work permits today, will that change tomorrow's outcome? Or are they still trapped in a city with the highest living costs anywhere in the country? No one's gonna like the answer to this question. So here we have a plethora of e-vehicles, all of which can be used for the one job that is the easiest to get, the most readily available for most asylum seekers, and that is a delivery job. At least that was the case up until some recent changes made by the city made it harder for people to do this job.
Well, it's supposed to be a big win for delivery workers in New York City.
But a new law requiring that they be paid a certain wage has come with some unintended consequences, one of them being that they actually earn fewer tips.
All right, Fox 5, just...
So these new minimum wage laws, they've now put the entire delivery workforce in jeopardy because now that there's a minimum wage, there is no longer a maximum amount of work. And this is particularly bad news for folks who may not qualify for a job at Goldman Sachs or the New York Times. Now, on paper, the idea of a minimum guaranteed wage for delivery riders sounds great. It sounds like it'll prevent people from being exploited. But look at this. Uber made specific changes to how their service works specifically for New York City. And it says right here, because of the new rules, we have to limit the number of couriers who can be online each hour of the day. And now, instead of anyone being able to just log on and immediately qualify to get work, they have a new scheduling system where you have to reserve the days that you're willing to work ahead of time, and preference is going to go to people who have prior successful experience, which means if you're new in town, you just got here, and now you're just getting evicted from your shelter, and you want to try to start working, even with work permission, it's going to be very hard for you to start climbing one of the only economic ladders that's available. Critics of this policy change say Uber is being greedy, but the company says that increasing the wages for delivery workers doesn't change the number of delivery orders they get every single day, which essentially means that although the city can mandate an hourly wage for delivery workers, they cannot mandate a specific number of delivery orders be placed every single day. And an economist would say that whenever you set a price floor for something, you limit the total number of people that can be employed in that system. On top of that, this new wage law has another unintended consequence for the asylum seekers. And unfortunately, it's also not a positive one.
Migrants from countries including Senegal, Mauritania, and Haiti, for example, speak French or their native language, language, and that makes everything more difficult. Stephanie Birch.
Now we come to the real issue that nobody wants to talk about. Language barriers are a huge obstacle to people who want to get on their feet in New York City, even though it's more of a multicultural melting pot than pretty much anywhere else in the country. But let me ask you something. What language does this publication write in? If that's not a language that you're proficient in, your employment opportunities with this company or any company will be severely limited. But people need a way to enter the economy and start building their skills no matter what. And the great thing about delivery jobs is that no matter what language you speak, with a smartphone, you can talk to the customers, get directions, and know exactly where to go. And when you see the numbers of bikes that are just parked here on the sidewalk, you've gotta feel something for the folks that would like to be using them riding around, earning a living, but are either unable to do that by virtue of unemployability due to a work visa, or have recently had their hours cut because it's not their turn to log in and accept jobs. And this whole situation with people being unable to find jobs and being told that they have to go out and provide for themselves on their own, even though that's not something that's going to be possible for them, it's brought up a big debate in the minds of many people. Should folks be able to get work authorization sooner? Also, what do you think about New York's minimum wage laws? Is it better to have a guaranteed minimum wage with hours being limited for people, or should folks be able to decide to work for an amount that is fair between them and their employer? And do you think it's right for New York City to fill up its shelters with people who can't provide for themselves, only to then change their minds about how long they want people to stay in them, telling them to leave and to go figure things out on their own when they don't have the legal ability to do that? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.